Bibliophiles of the internet, we find ourselves in a very exciting time where it's both the run-up to Halloween and also the run-up to one of my most anticipated film adaptations of the year, which is Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, of course. So whether you're in the mood for something scary, creepy, or strange, or whether you want to read something about Frankenstein or in the tradition of Frankenstein, I have quite a few ideas for what you can read to get into the right headspace. Very quickly, I'll just say that I love a Frankenstein story. To me, Frankenstein is very much about the experience of being the other in society, not fitting into the world or not being anticipated in the world from the moment of your inception. That lack of agency where your existence is not seen as self-evident, but rather as something created and defined by the people around you rather than something that comes from yourself. In my opinion, any good Frankenstein story or retelling or reimagining is intrinsically interrogating this question of not only what does it mean to be human and to be alive, but what does it mean to count as a person in society, in the world, who is worthy of freedom and love and life itself. I'm going to start with more straightforward recommendations that engage directly with Frankenstein or continue the story established in Frankenstein, and then get more abstract as we go. The first book I'll mention very briefly is one that I'm sure no one's going to like to hear, because if you're excited about the upcoming Frankenstein adaptation, you should probably read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley herself. Again, I know that's tough to hear. I know that's a bit of a cheat in terms of recommendations as well, but in my humble opinion, this classic actually fucks. If you know nothing about Frankenstein, it is a classic sci-fi horror story about a scientist named Victor Frankenstein who is experimenting with reanimation and creating a form of life that is not instigated by natural reproduction, but instead purely by science. He ends up creating this monster who is highly intellectual and sympathetic, and he eventually realizes that he cannot control this creature or keep him completely separate from society, and things begin to collapse from there. Like I said, this one's pretty self-explanatory. I don't think it needs any further endorsement. PRH did recently release a really beautiful new edition with a foreword from Jeanette Winterson, who we will circle back to later. So if you've never read it before, that might be something to look into. That might be a really fun page-to-screen experience. If that's not your speed, and that's totally okay, the next book I have to recommend is an extremely cool graphic novel adaptation. That would be Gris Grimley's Frankissstein. This is like an edgy, grudgy, punk rock take on Frankenstein. It's pretty much retelling the classic story from top to bottom as a comic. It is an abridged version of the original text, but it's also doing really cool things by blending together classic comic panels with sections of prose. In essence, sort of Frankensteining together these two disparate mediums in really interesting ways. The artwork in this adaptation is so fucking cool. I read it over a decade ago and it's still on my shelf because I enjoyed it that much. So if you're looking for a more accessible entryway into Mary Shelley's classic, I feel like this is the way to go. Moving on to adaptations of Frankenstein that expand the world of the original story, obviously I could not make this video and not talk about the absolutely extraordinary book that is Our Hideous Progeny by C.E. McGill. This is basically a sequel to Frankenstein. It's a queer historical sci-fi story set in the 1850s following Mary, who is actually Victor Frankenstein's great niece and a scientist within her own right. She and her husband are trying to make a name for themselves in the field of paleontology, but they're not very well off, and the only people making a splash in the scientific community at this time are people who are wealthy enough to fund their own research and who have connections with other people in the field, neither of which they have. But when Mary discovers her great-uncle's papers that allude to his discovery, she decides to improve upon that research and make a creature of her own. I cannot tell you how much I love this book. Not only is it aesthetically astounding because it's basically like if you put Frankenstein and a historical twist on Jurassic Park together, but it's also interrogating this concept of who and what in society is most often deemed monstrous. As a queer female scientist in the 1850s, there are so many parts of Mary herself that are not deemed fit for society, that the world around her is deemed as undesirable, unnatural, inhuman. So all of that very much informs her relationship with the creature that she creates and why she makes the choices that she does. I won't say more than that, but if you're only going to take one recommendation from this video, let it be this book. I haven't read this next book myself, but I think it's definitely worth checking out, and that is The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein by Kirsten White. This is actually a retelling of the events of Frankenstein as told from Elizabeth's point of view. She's Victor Frankenstein's cousin, who is one of the central characters in the original story. This is also a YA adaptation, I believe, that begins before the events of Frankenstein, retracing the story of how Elizabeth experienced a lot of hardship in her childhood until she was eventually brought to a new home where she met a young Victor Frankenstein, and his family ends up taking her in as one of their own. own, and the two of them become very close friends and confidants. But as they grow older, Elizabeth feels that her continued survival depends on going along with whatever Victor wants and entertaining his every depraved whim, which obviously eventually takes a very dark turn. Again, I haven't read this one myself, so I can't personally vouch for quality, but I think this sounds like a really interesting take on the classic story that brings some more depth and backstory to the original character dynamics, and it comes from a very unique perspective. I would also recommend Victor Laval's Destroyer, which is obviously written by Victor Laval and illustrated by Dietrich Smith. This is a collection of comics set in 2017 when Frankenstein's monster has discarded any notion of peace and inclusion and instead has set his sights on vengeance. He has become a machine known as the Destroyer, whose goal is to eliminate the scourge of humanity from the face of the planet. He eventually finds a partner in Dr. Baker, a descendant of the Frankenstein family whose teenage son was unfortunately killed by police. There are two other scientists, Percy and Byron, who initially believe they're supposed to be protecting Dr. Baker from the monster, but they eventually realize they should be protecting the entire world from the monster and the doctor's combined wrath. This is a really powerful comic that explores love, loss, and vengeance. I appreciate that it's a modern take on the monster's righteous vengeance and anger towards collective humankind, which has never done him any favors, and explores how he's experienced untold amounts of injustice. I think it's important when stories push back on this idea that anger is inherently monstrous, especially when Black people specifically are constantly having their anger policed or villainized based on racist stereotypes. Anger can be powerful, anger can be righteous, anger can definitely be weaponized, but it's also a natural human emotion, so it's interesting to see how that complicates the Destroyer's journey in this comic. Now we're going to get a little bit further away from the source material. The rest of these books contain key elements of the original Frankenstein story because they play with aspects of reanimation, the invention of monsters, controversial science, the piecing together of things that don't naturally go together, or because thematically they touch on many of the same frequencies as the original classic. Again, starting a bit closer to the source material and eventually moving further outwards, I would definitely recommend a recent read of mine called Stitch by Padraig Kenny. This is a middle grade adventure story about a young Frankenstein character named Stitch, who along with his best friend Henry Oaf was brought to life by a scientist. But when the professor's wicked nephew takes over the laboratory, Stitch and Henry decide that escaping into the human world is their only viable choice, even if the rest of the world might only ever see them as horrible monsters. While this story does definitely touch on some darker content like death, grief, and the experience of discrimination, it's also a very lighthearted and open-hearted story about a young boy determined to do good things with the life that he has, regardless of how he was given that life. It's taking one of those central questions from Frankenstein about how we define the parameters of personhood and reframes that question as what's more important, being seen as a person or being known as someone who does good and does what's right. I don't see those things as being mutually exclusive, but I think it's a very good story, and I think it's a really fun, sweet, sincere spin on Frankenstein that's great for younger audiences. Next up, let's talk about Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Sadawi, translated by Jonathan Wright from the original Arabic. This is set on the streets of US-occupied Baghdad, where a scavenger named Hadi has decided to collect human remains from victims of all this US-sanctioned violence and stitch them all together to create a single corpse. He does this as an act of protest, hoping that when the government sees not just pieces of people but an actual corpse, they will grant the people of Baghdad the ability to give their fallen proper burials. But before that can happen, the corpse goes missing, and the city is suddenly flooded with reports about a horrifying criminal who is terrorizing the streets and cannot be killed. I'm really interested in this one and have been for quite some time. The reason why it captures my attention is because, again, it's using the aesthetic of Frankenstein and the iconic imagery and concepts of that classic story and repurposes them into a modern context to make a statement about the current state of our world. And I think that's what a good reimagining does. Another Frankenstein reimagining that I read recently was Chicano Frankenstein by Daniel A. Olivas. This is a small book from an indie press. It's set in this somewhat futuristic version of the US where the reanimation process, though controversial, has become very widespread and almost commonplace, especially as a tactic for boosting the economy and replacing aging workforces. But there's also a sect of people, including the US president, who are staunchly anti-reanimation and who are working to pass legislation that strips away the reanimated community's basic rights. The main character of the story is an unnamed reanimated paralegal who is not only trying to navigate the world as all these changes continue to roll out, but who's also trying to rediscover his first life history that was all but erased lost due to the reanimation process. I would say this is a surprisingly slice-of-life story. It's undoubtedly a political story that makes sure the reader is very aware of the story's political climate and what exactly is at stake, socially and legally, for the characters, but it's not about directly contending with that corruption. It's not about grappling with the system or protesting or dismantling systems that are unjust. It's a story that's more interested in exploring the question of how do we survive in a world that does not want us to survive and is not built for us to survive. I think you can tell from the title, but this is more of a Frankenstein-inspired story where the experience of otherness very much maps onto the immigrant experience, and that the story addresses the question of what it means to truly belong to a place and how the prevalence of assimilation can be very dangerous. Another reimagining I would suggest checking out is Unwieldy Creatures by Addie Tsai. This is billed as a biracial, queer, gender-swapped retelling of Frankenstein following 3 central characters. There's Plum, who is a biracial Chinese intern at one of the world's top embryology labs, Dr. Frank, who is a queer biracial Indonesian scientist who is desperately searching for a way to procreate that does not involve sperm or eggs, and Dr. Frank's eventual non-binary creation. Obviously, when it comes to classic retellings that are queer, I do not need to be persuaded. My arm does not need to be twisted. I am convinced. I am sold. And what intrigues me about this retelling is that it really leans into that blend of sci-fi and horror that comes from the original story, but it comes from a completely different angle, and it also seems to be exploring the dangers of hubris. Another Frankenstein-inspired book that's been on my TBR since last year is A Botanical Daughter by Noah Medlock. This is a queer historical horror story about 2 Victorian gentlemen who have to hide away their relationship deep behind the walls of a botanical garden. Simon spends his days doing taxidermical art in the basement workshop while Gregor works with exotic plants, and one day Gregor discovers a strange fungus that shows signs of sentience and intelligence. So he decides to experiment with this fungus by planting it into a corpse. That corpse eventually comes to life, and the 2 men decide to rename her as Chloe and make her part of their life. But of course, Chloe can never truly have a normal life in the outside world, and as the mycelium continues growing, they begin to wonder who exactly is cultivating whom. I actually bought a copy of this at a recent author event, and I'm very excited to eventually get to it. I'm very intrigued with this blend of historical sci-fi and nature horror. It also seems like the story is using those Frankenstein elements in new and queer ways to reflect on the nature of what is forbidden in society and what can only exist and even thrive in the most hidden parts of the world. Of course, I could not make this video and not talk about Monstrilio by Gerardo Samano Cordova. This is a queer Latine horror story that's very much about grief. It's set in Mexico City and follows a grieving mother named Magos who recently lost her son. And in an act of desperation and fierce maternal instinct, she cuts out a piece of his lung and decides to nurture it in secret. Much to everyone's surprise, that piece of lung eventually grows into a child, but he doesn't look or act like children normally do, and his family realizes if they can't suppress or hide his vicious nature, then they might squander his precious second chance at life. I love this book so much. I can't even really describe it. It's such a powerful meditation on grief, and it's very much within the tradition of Frankenstein because it's about the idea of forbidden creation and what it means to love and nurture someone that both the laws of nature and society itself claims should not exist. Like many of the other stories I've already mentioned, this one is also interrogating the idea of who and what we deem to be inherently and intrinsically monstrous, and how that can become even more compounded when we find ourselves at the intersections of the margins. I said we'd circle back to Jeanette Winterson, and indeed we have, because now we're going to talk about her book, Frankissstein. This is a modern-day reimagining of Frankenstein following a young trans doctor named Rye who is falling for a celebrated professor known as Victor Stein, who is leading the public debate around AI and also carrying out some secret experiments in a vast underground network of tunnels. Meanwhile, there's another character named Ron Lord who plans to make a fortune by launching a generation of sentient sex dolls. There are cryogenic facilities overseas that house the dead bodies of countless people, bodies that he plans to repurpose and bring back to life. This sounds very intriguing, very twisted, very strange. I appreciate that this retelling is coming at the original story from an angle that focuses on bodily autonomy as well as the question of who or what qualifies as monstrous. I think it also makes a lot of sense to place this story in the 21st century and bring in these relevant conversations about transness, which some people would incorrectly argue is unnatural, and also AI technologies, which are diluting our perception of humanity and reality in so many ways. Those are all the Frankenstein and Frankenstein adjacent books I had to recommend for you today. Of course, if you know of any other retellings or books that touch on the same concepts or themes of the classic Frankenstein story, feel free to drop those down below in the comments for other folks. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.